My name is Nora Callahan, and I'm 34. 2 weeks ago, my sister stormed into my apartment and screamed, "You selfish woman. 6 years I let you play mother to my kids, and now you say no just because some man asked you on a trip. Without me, you'd be nothing. I saved your worthless life." My mother nodded along with every word. My father stayed silent, hat still on his head, eyes on the floor. But my brother-in-law, standing in the doorway with a set of keys still hanging from his fingers, finally asked the question none of us had dared to ask in 7 years. "Answer her, Renee. Where do you actually go every weekend?" My sister went pale. Everyone in that room thought this was another fight about babysitting. It wasn't. It was about a woman waiting in a small brick building an hour and a half away, the mother-in-law my sister had let everyone believe was dead. To understand how that morning happened, you have to go back to the Friday before it. The diaper bag on my counter. A drawing I hadn't understood for over a year. It was almost 5 in the morning when I got home from my shift. I manage the deli counter at a co-op grocery on the edge of town, and on weekdays I start before dawn. That Friday I'd stayed late helping a new hire close the ovens, so it was closer to 5 by the time I pulled into my driveway, windows down, the radio playing to no one but me. I let myself into the kitchen, and there on my dining table was a car seat with my nephew Theo strapped into it, sound asleep, a diaper bag propped beside him. I stood there a long moment without moving. Theo was 4, breathing evenly under the same fleece blanket he'd had since he was a baby. Behind him on the counter sat a box of grocery store muffins, my mother's peace offering whenever she'd already made a decision she knew I wouldn't agree to. My father had used his spare key. He'd done it before, whenever he wanted to skip a conversation entirely. But this time was different, because the night before, in the family group chat that had existed since I could remember, I had typed one sentence, "I have plans." My mother read it and didn't answer. My sister read it 45 seconds later and didn't answer either. 12 hours after that, my father walked into my kitchen and left my nephew on the table like a delivery. I checked my phone. A message from Daniel was waiting from that morning. "Still on for today? Grace already packed the marshmallows." Daniel Whitmore was a landscape architect I'd been seeing for 3 months, a quiet man raising his 9-year-old daughter Grace alone since losing his wife. He'd invited me to a cabin a few hours west for the weekend. It was the first time in 6 years I'd said no to my sister. His daughter had asked if I could come. I wrote back, "Give me a couple hours," then opened the drawer under my coffee maker, where I kept unpaid bills, and a drawing my niece Josie had made me over a year earlier. It was crayon on cardstock, a woman with white hair and a woman with long hair, holding each other. In careful print at the bottom, in Josie's handwriting, "For Mommy's friend Helen." I didn't know a Helen. When I'd asked Josie about it once, she'd shrugged and said, "Mommy has a friend named Helen. I haven't met her." Then, without looking up from her crayons, she'd added, "But you can keep this for me." I had kept it. I hadn't thought about it in months. I set it next to the muffins and the diaper bag and looked at all 3, and something in my chest told me none of it added up. Theo woke up crying, and I didn't have an answer yet. To understand the last 6 years, you have to go back to when it started. In the spring everything shut down. My sister called me late on a Friday night, crying, saying her husband Marcus had tested positive and she needed to keep the kids away from him for a few days. "Mom and Dad are too old to be around them," she said. "It's just you." Milo was 5. Josie was 2. Theo wasn't born yet. I said yes before she finished the sentence. 3 days became 4, 4 became 6. When she finally came to get them, she was hours late, brought me 2 bottles of kombucha, and wouldn't say where she'd been. When I asked how Marcus was doing, she said, "He's fine, tired, which didn't match the urgency from a few days before, but I was too exhausted to hold both versions in my head at once. The next Friday, she called again, this time about herself. "I'll lose my mind if I don't get one day alone," she said. My mother called that same night to tell me I was the only one in the family with nothing to lose, and that I needed to share it. By the end of that month I'd babysat 2 weekends straight for a husband who was no longer sick. By the following spring I had a rhythm. By summer, I had a spare crib. My nephew Milo once crawled into my lap and asked if I was his mother's sister. I told him yes. He thought about it and said, "I thought Mommy said you were my mother." I asked where he'd heard that. He shrugged and fell asleep on my shoulder. By winter, my mother had printed out a calendar, an actual quarterly grid on yellow paper, with my name filled into every Saturday and Sunday for 3 straight months. "I thought if it was on your fridge, you'd feel less rushed," she told me. "Your sister would too." I didn't say anything. She left. Without deciding to, I put the calendar up with a magnet shaped like a cat. That was the first time I watched myself obey something I'd never agreed to. Theo was born the following November. I spent 2 nights in a hospital chair with Milo on one shoulder and Josie on the other because Marcus was on deadline at work and couldn't help. A nurse checking on my sister looked at me and said, "You're a wonderful mother, your oldest is so attached to you." I didn't correct her. I looked down at Milo and felt, for the first time, the specific shape of something being taken from me. The following year, my sister started calling her weekends retreats. She posted photos from wooden cabins with captions like "Where I go to remember who I am," no location tagged. Once I noticed a shop sign in the background of one photo and typed the name into a search bar. An address came up in a city almost 2 hours from her house. I told myself she must have stopped there on her way home. I told myself that for 2 years straight. When she expanded her yoga studio from 1 room to 3, I wasn't at the grand opening because I was home holding my niece's hair back while she was sick. My sister posted a photo that same night, grateful for the family who believed in me, and I wasn't in a single frame. She told the local paper the studio had been funded by hard work and sponsorships. I chose to believe her. What else was I supposed to do? There's a story my sister told about me for a very long time, and I let her tell it because it started with something she'd actually done. Years ago, in my last year of college, I got pregnant. The father, a freshman I barely knew, asked for time to think and never called again. My father is the kind of Baptist who once went 3 years without speaking to his own brother over who he'd married, and only broke the silence the day my father needed heart surgery. I knew what my family did with disappointment. So when the test came back positive, I called my sister instead. She drove 3 hours to get me, held me while I cried, and drove me to a clinic 10 days later. She paid in cash from an envelope she'd prepared in advance. She waited in the parking lot while I went in alone. Afterward she made me soup and said one more thing on the drive home: "Mom and Dad don't need to know. If Dad ever found out, he'd do to you what he did to Uncle Landry." I nodded. I stayed with her for a week. And for the next 12 years, that single act became the debt she cashed in over and over. I saved you. You owe me. Without me, you'd have nobody. By last spring, I'd started writing her exact words down, not to build a case against her, just to make sure I wasn't imagining the pattern. A small notebook, kept in my nightstand. By the night I finally said no, there were 40 entries. The last one, from that same afternoon: "You owe me. You know you owe me." There were 3 moments over those years that I noticed and didn't act on, and I want to tell you about them, because noticing something and doing nothing about it doesn't disappear, it just waits. The first was a Christmas Eve. My sister left our parents' house for 2 hours, supposedly to visit a lonely elderly friend, and came back with a small white pastry box she never opened. By morning it was gone. The second was the following spring. I was watching Josie, then 6, while my sister was at a weekend retreat. Josie slid a piece of cardstock across my table, the drawing of 2 women holding each other, and asked me to hold on to it for her, since Mommy said it wasn't the right day to give it. I asked who Helen was. She shrugged. I put the drawing in a drawer and didn't think about it again for a long time. The third was the following winter. My sister stayed over on my couch one night, and while doing her laundry I found a thermal-printed slip in her coat pocket, a visitor log from a place called Willow Ridge, room 214, signed R. Callahan, dated the weekend before. Nobody in our family had any relatives in assisted living. I photographed it, put it back exactly where I found it, searched the address, saw the driving distance was over an hour, and did nothing. That's the part people don't understand about being the reliable one. You don't refuse to know things. You just choose, one small decision at a time, not to look up from what you're already carrying. Daniel came into my shop in late winter asking about sourdough, his daughter Grace reading on the bench behind him with a muffin in hand. He came back the next week and asked me to coffee. For 3 months we saw each other, always on weekdays, and he never once asked why. In early spring he invited me to a cabin. I told him I'd think about it. That same weekend, I stopped by my sister's studio and told her I couldn't babysit the following Saturday. She stopped folding yoga blocks. Which weekend? She asked. This one, I said. No, she said, flat, like declining a delivery option. I'm going out of town, I told her. With who? She asked. Someone, I said. She stared at the blocks for a long moment and said we'd talk about it. We didn't. That Thursday night I sent the text to the family chat. Friday morning at dawn, my father let himself into my kitchen with my nephew. That night, Daniel called to say my sister had phoned him claiming I had the flu. He read me the number. It was my mother's landline. He asked if my family was always like this. I sat on my back steps for a long time without answering. What I didn't know then was that my mother had spent that same hour on the phone with my sister, calling Daniel some man with a little girl and telling her to come talk sense into me the next day. At 10:30 the next morning, my parents let themselves into my apartment without knocking. My mother set the muffins down like an offering and said my sister would be there in 10 minutes, that they'd come so nobody would yell. Somebody already had, I told her. She pretended not to hear. Then a car braked hard outside, and my sister walked in without closing the door behind her, wearing the specific expression of someone who'd rehearsed a speech the whole drive over. She screamed the words that would become the whole story. Selfish. 6 years. Without me you'd be nothing. My mother nodded along in a slow, practiced rhythm, like she'd been waiting years to hear it out loud. My father sat with his hat still on, staring at the carpet. When my sister finally finished, I said the sentence I'd been holding on to far longer than she'd held hers. Then tell them where you actually go every weekend. The room went still. My mother stopped nodding. My sister asked what I'd said. I repeated it, slower. Tell them, Renee. Tell them where you go on Saturdays. Behind her, the front door she'd left open swung wider. Marcus was standing there with the spare key still in his hand, the one my sister had never given back. I don't know how much he'd heard from the driveway, but it was clearly enough. He looked at his wife, then at me, then at my parents, and in the tired, careful voice of a man who'd been afraid to ask a question for a long time, he said the words that changed everything. Answer her, Renee. Where do you really go every weekend? My sister turned around. I watched the color drain out of her face in slow motion. She opened her mouth twice and nothing came out, The silence went on for what felt like a full minute. Then my father stood, walked to the door without looking at any of us, and said, in a voice that sounded older than I'd ever heard from him, "Some questions you don't ask if you're not ready to hear the answer." Then he left. My mother followed, leaving the muffins behind. Marcus closed the door, picked Theo up from the other room, and asked me quietly if I knew where she went. "I know part of it," I told him. "I don't know enough to tell you, but I know who does." He asked who. I looked at my sister. I said, "Josie." My sister looked up for the first time since Marcus had walked in and said one word. "Don't." By the next day she'd chosen a different weapon, a long post in the extended family group online, 4 paragraphs that never named me but didn't need to. I've spent 12 years protecting my sister from choices she made when she was young. Now she's using her grief to hurt my family. Comments rolled in from cousins, from my mother's church friends. One, from a name I didn't recognize, said Renee, "Not now, not like this," and was deleted 3 minutes later. I'd learn who she was soon enough. That Monday night, a man I hadn't spoken to in 12 years, the one from my college years, texted to ask if I was okay, saying my sister had called him with things about me he didn't recognize. I told him I was fine and didn't need anything, and turned off my phone. My mother called the next night, asking who had told my sister about my abortion, her voice tight in the way it gets when she's rehearsing a question. "She's always known," I told her. "She's the one who paid." The line went quiet for a long 12 seconds. "Your sister took you and never told me," my mother finally said. "You didn't want to know," I told her. "That isn't the same as not knowing." She hung up and didn't call for 2 days. Marcus called me from a hotel room he checked into, asking if I had the address of the place his mother was supposedly staying. I told him I did and asked for one more day. He gave it to me. That Thursday morning, I sat at my kitchen table with 3 things in front of me: the drawing, the photograph of the visitor slip, and a memory from earlier that spring, my niece, in the passenger seat of my car, telling me quietly that Grandma Helen was Daddy's mommy from when he was little, but Daddy doesn't remember her because he's too sad, and that Mommy said not to tell because Daddy would cry. I'd pulled over on the highway that day and told myself she was just a 7-year-old with an active imagination. Sitting at my table months later, I finally understood I'd been wrong. I drove to my niece's school and asked her teacher if I could talk to Josie at recess. Sitting with her on a bench, I asked if she remembered telling me about Grandma Helen. She said she did. She'd met her twice, once at Christmas, once in early spring. "She lives in a house with lots of grandmas," Josie said between bites of crackers. "The first time I brought her a family photo, she cried. Mommy said she was crying because she missed Daddy from when he was little. Mommy said not to tell Daddy because he'd cry too." I watched an 8-year-old carry a secret that wasn't hers to carry. I asked if she thought her father should know. She looked at the drawing I'd brought, looked at me, and nodded slowly. "Grandma Helen said she's waited a long time," Josie told me. "She doesn't want to wait anymore." I drove the hour and a half to Willow Ridge that afternoon. It was a low brick building with a garden of yellow mums out front. At the front desk, I asked for room 214, Helen Ward. The receptionist asked if I was family. I told her I was the sister of her daughter-in-law. She turned the guest log toward me to sign, and above my line was an entry from the weekend before, R. Callahan, Saturday to Sunday. I found room 214 down the hall. The woman my brother-in-law had believed dead for 25 years was sitting in a green armchair with a book on her lap. She looked up and said simply, "You're Nora. Josie drew you for me." She poured me tea and told me her story without once crying. Years earlier, after a car accident left her hooked on pain medication, her older sister Marion had taken her to a treatment facility, and her husband, ashamed, exhausted, had told their teenage son she'd died rather than explain the truth. She'd gotten sober and stayed that way for over a decade, working part-time and eventually moving into Willow Ridge. A few years back, at a retreat, she'd recognized my sister from a photo she'd quietly followed online and introduced herself. My sister told her Marcus was in financial trouble, that the kids needed things, that helping quietly was the only way, that he could never know or it would break him. None of it was true. From then on, my sister visited every weekend, bringing news of grandchildren Helen had never met, and taking money. Every spare dollar of her Social Security, the proceeds from an old wedding ring she'd sold, savings built up over years. Nearly $40,000 over 6 years, funneled straight into my sister's studio. Helen handed me a notebook where she'd tracked every gift in blue pen, believing the whole time she was quietly helping her son. I asked what she wanted me to do. "This isn't your story to carry," she told me. "If you don't want to tell him, I understand. I've waited 25 years, I can wait longer." I told her she'd waited long enough, that I hadn't been waiting, I'd been careful, and that wasn't the same thing. She smiled for the first time. "I could tell the second you walked in," she said. "You aren't someone who waits." My sister came to see me that Sunday, alone except for Theo, clearly hoping his presence would soften me. It didn't, it just made her look like someone who'd shown up years too late. She asked for 6 months before telling Marcus. "I need to protect the kids, protect the studio," she said, and slid a printout across the table, a payment pending in my name for $19,000. "You could still go on that trip. Nobody has to know you turned it down." I looked at the number, then at the notebook sitting beside it. "You're paying me with her money," I told her. She stared at it for a long time, then admitted quietly that she'd meant to tell him eventually, that there was always a new reason to wait, that she'd gotten addicted to being needed, not by her husband, but by his mother. I gave her 48 hours. "If you haven't told him by the holiday cookout, I will." She didn't tell him. So at the cookout, with everyone gathered in my parents' backyard, my niece, with the perfect timing of a child who'd been asked to keep one secret too many, asked in front of everyone if she could show me the drawing she'd made for Grandma Helen. My mother's fork froze midair. I set the original drawing on the table, then the visitor slipped beside it, and told the whole yard exactly where my sister had been driving every weekend for 6 years. Then I called Willow Ridge on speaker, and a receptionist cheerfully confirmed Helen's regular Saturday visit from Renee, mentioning that Josie had drawn her something new. Nobody at that table moved. Marcus looked at my sister the way a man looks at his own house after a fire. "You gave me 7 years of not knowing my mother was alive," he said quietly. "And you thought that was love?" My father set down his tongs and said, "So only my mother and I could hear. We didn't ask because we didn't want to know." My mother closed her eyes. Marcus walked to the bench under the tree in the corner of the yard. Josie followed and sat beside him. Everyone else found somewhere else to be. The next morning Marcus drove to Willow Ridge without calling ahead. He stayed 4 hours. He didn't ask about my sister. He just sat with his mother while she told him everything, holding an old photograph in both hands. "I want to know you now," he told her. That night he called his father, who admitted, after a long silence, that he'd thought it would be easier for his son to believe she was gone. It was the only honest thing the man said. My own father asked Marcus to come by the next day. They sat together in my father's old garage for over an hour. Nobody knows what was said, but Marcus texted me afterward, "Your father finally said what he should have said years ago." It wasn't enough, but it was true. A few days later my mother found me at work and told me, without asking for forgiveness, that she knew she'd stood on the wrong side of my whole life. I told her I'd hurt her, and that I wasn't ready yet. She nodded and left. I watched her sit in her car in the parking lot for a long time afterward, not moving. Helen came into the shop that same morning, before my mother did, walking in with her sister Marion, smiling the way someone smiles after 25 years of not being able to. She bought a loaf of bread and told me, before she left, "Thank you for speaking. I know you don't owe me anything, but you gave me my son back." That night, my niece drew a second postcard, this one for her father, showing a little house with 3 figures underneath, labeled Daddy, Josie, and Grandma Helen. Marcus held it with both hands and slid it into his wallet, next to the address he now kept close by on purpose. The next morning, I drove out to the cabin with Daniel and Grace. No signal, no noise, just a wood stove and more stars than I remembered existing. For a few hours, for the first time in years, I didn't think about any of it. Late that night, Daniel asked if I wanted another weekend like this one. I told him yes, but this time I'm choosing it. 6 years, I gave away because I was told that without her, I'd have nobody. It turned out nobody was exactly who she said she was.